What moment in history that's hard to believe it actually happened? That time Emperor Napoleon escaped from the island he was imprisoned on after his army was finally defeated. Snuck back into France under the nose of King Louis VI and literally every royal guard and roadblock from Marseille to Paris. Then when he was actually caught just outside of Paris, he managed to persuade the soldiers, who just so happened to be former Bonapartists, to escort him into Paris, where he managed to successfully cause the king to flee. On top of raising a full army to wage war against Europe again. The only time in history an emperor took back an entire country just by waving his hat. An illiterate 14-year-old French farm girl claimed to see visions and hear the voice of God. So she enlisted in the French army and led them to miraculous victories. Until she was condemned for heresy and burned at the stake. Later, she was canonized as a saint. I already posted once. But I got another one. There were still Japanese soldiers well into the 1970s who had no idea the WW2 was over. Like, they just got left behind by the Navy and held out on isolated islands. For decades. One guy in particular spent his time feuding with the Filipino police. Everyone tried to tell him the war was over. But he thought it was a bunch of propaganda. Word eventually got back to Japan, where they had to look up his commanding officer, who had since left the military for a career as a businessman, and fly him to the Philippines. Only after receiving a direct order from his commanding officer did the guy stand down. There were two that held out until the 90s. There are even still a few who are unaccounted for. And there have been unconfirmed reports of these holdouts in various remote areas. Though the amount of time having passed since World War II would seem to indicate that most of them are likely dead. Which is a bit sad. War of the Bucket. This was a war in 1325 between Bologna and Modena fought because, I shit you not, Modena stole Bologna's town bucket. Modena won and still holds the bucket today. Edit. 14,000 internet points later and I found out I left a mobile link like some kind of war criminal. Couldn't Bologna just get another bucket? Were buckets that scarce on the ground? Buckets are one of the most rare things in the world. They are so expensive that people make a list to see them before they die. Dancing plague around the 14th and 17th centuries. Large groups of people dancing on the streets until they collapsed from exhaustion. It is so strange that is hard to believe. Then again in the 70s. That outbreak is more often referred to as disco. That time America dropped a nuke on North Carolina. The pilot, oops. The B-52 carrying the bombs basically disintegrated. The bombs fell and the only thing that stopped them was a low voltage switch. 6 of the 7 stages the bomb had to go through to detonate had worked. The last one didn't. That a Roman emperor died because he gave himself a brain aneurysm from yelling so much at some envoys. Just to be that guy, and because I just learned this recently, having an aneurysm doesn't really do anything. Usually, it's basically just a bloated blood vessel. Bursting an aneurysm, however, can cause a shit ton of problems. The Romans would flood the Colosseum with water and have naval battles there. That's a crazy level of engineering for the time. And shows how wealthy the Roman Empire was. That couldn't have been an easy feat to pull off. That's a crazy level of engineering for now. Stadiums already cost billions without needing to be capable of occasional naval battles. The 1904 Summer Olympics Marathon, where the winner was given a mixture of rat poison and brandy by his trainers. A Cuban postman finished in 4th despite getting food poisoning midway through the race. And a couple runners were nearly killed due to the generally poor conditions and organization officiating of the race. Landing men on the moon using processing technology that I wouldn't want powering my phone. Landing people on the moon wasn't a computer problem. It was a rocket problem. And it still is. It is not about a computer's capabilities. It is about the math. The math was figured out before said launch. This dude, Emperor Norton, was a real hoot. Declared himself Emperor of the US and many just sort of went along with it. He even exchanged letters with the Queen. Joshua Norton was buried on Sunday, the 10th of January 1880. 10,000 people filed past the body as it lay in state, and his funeral cortege was over 2 miles long. His burial was marked by a total eclipse of the sun. He was the first and last emperor of the United States of America. I have one. On the 10th of March, 1942, just over 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans fled Java Island. But they inadvertently left behind 18 Americans. So a person called Master Sergeant Harry Hayes repaired a B-17 and, despite having no flight training before, let alone flown a plane, he successfully piloted the bomber, along with the other 17 Americans, to Australia. Even without maps and instruments. Pretty close. Hayes didn't pilot the plane himself. A civilian pilot, who had briefly flown a B-17 before, and a Dutch officer were the pilot and co-pilot on the flight. The neat part though was they only had 3 good engines but still made the 8-hour flight to Australia with the last of the evacuees, including the civilian pilot's wife. President John Quincy Adams once sent an alligator to Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette had no idea what the duck to do with it, so he gave it back. Edit, added Quincy in for clarification. The Great Emu War. Spoiler alert, the emus won. When your boy Caesar was kidnapped by pirates and he laughed at them for low ransom and told them to raise it. Then over the course of time it took the Romans to raise the money. Caesar developed something of a friendship with the pirates to the point where he was joining in with their games and exercises. When the ransom arrived, he handed it over to the pirates and was set free. With his freedom he returned to the pirate ship, which was still where he left it, took them as prisoners and then crucified them. Edit, yeah, I forgot to mention that he told them previously he'd crucify them, but they thought he was joking. Didn't Australia name a pool after a drowned PM? Like, really guys? That one time a fleet of 14 Dutch warships got captured by French cavalry. The 1995 break-in at Sussex Drive, Canadian Prime Minister's home. Attempted murder thwarted by PM's wife brandishing loon statue. My favorite part is PM Craig, after his wife woke him in a panic, tried to tell her it's just a dream. https://en.m.wiki.org/andr_dollar#the_break-in. TL. Very Canadian assassination attempt. The time Liechtenstein invaded Italy with an army of 80 soldiers and returned with 81. Also the time Switzerland invaded Liechtenstein by mistake. Realized they just invaded Liechtenstein. Apologized and left. As a former soldier in the UK Army, for me it's the Northern Ireland peace process. I served a tour of South Armagh in 1986 and I could never see peace happening. So it's huge compliments to all involved in bringing peace. Viking Seeger appears. Leader pretended he was dead and asked to be buried in Paris. The French let him in. He jumped out the coffin and opened the city gates to his army. Edit, wasn't Paris, I believe it was an Italian town near Rome. Leader was Bjorn Ironside, not Ragnar. The most respectful territory control that currently happens. Hans Island is a small island that is contested territory between Canada and Denmark. Every few months, a platoon from one of the nations goes to the island, takes down the other country's flag to put up their own, drinks a crate of booze left behind by the other army. They'll drop a crate of their own booze and then leave. A ragtag volunteer army took on and defeated a world superpower. The comments have been awesome. This is a story repeated by many people, many times, throughout history. We should all be proud of our ancestors, which really should have given the US pause when they took on a ragtag volunteer army in Vietnam. Wait a minute. We are now a world superpower facing resistance from a bunch of soldier of the soil types thousands of miles away on terrain we're unfamiliar with. Not being old enough to remember it happening, it's really difficult for me to imagine what it would be like if someone literally shot the US president. Like, I can't even imagine seeing that news come across the wire. It seems like the biggest holy shit moment I can imagine. Honestly, with the unbridled hatred for the current and previous president from each side, I'm surprised that it hasn't happened at some point in the last 9 years. The typing rebellion. Nearly 100 million people dead because some guy failed his exams to become a government official and had horrible stress-induced fever dreams he deemed to be visions 5 years later. He decided the visions meant he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, meant to spread Christianity throughout China and overthrow the existing dynasty. So he gathered a following, created an army, and hilled his way across China. More people died than the combatants of both world wars combined. If someone wrote a movie with that plot, you'd think it was ridiculous beyond belief. Such an immense loss of life. And most people in the Western world don't even know that it happened. The Christmas truce in World War I. Guys from both sides crossed the lines and celebrated Christmas with each other. Then went back to their respective lines and resumed killing each other. Some people find it touching. I find it straight up bizarre. Rwanda. I still can't believe that I was in high school during one of the most well-planned and carried out genocidal massacres of the second half of the 20th century. Everyone watched it happen. And still we just went on with our lives. If you haven't seen Hotel Rwanda yet, watch it. A man with zero political experience, no background in socio-economics, or even a demonstrable understanding of those things, was elected to the highest office in the land. Just how many times nuclear war was avoided during the Cold War because one person, despite their orders protocol being to push the big red button, thought yay, no. I would prefer not to be the person who pushes the button that causes human extinction. I have enough shit on my conscience as it is. The 335 years war between the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands started in 1651 and ended in 1986 when a historian was trying to debunk the myth that the two were at war. He discovered that the two were in fact at war and didn't know it. This prompted the signing of a peace treaty to end the longest war to have 0 battles and no bloodshed. The Dutch more or less declared war and forgot about it. The Dutch ambassador joked that it must have been harrowing for the Scillians to know we could have attacked at any moment. Edit, to correct some ambiguity. The Isles of Scilly are a region of Britain, not a country. A Japanese guy started slithering on the floor claiming he was a snake. His parents thought he was possessed by a snake, so they bit and headbutted their son, killing him. Source, Wikipedia.org. That a Greek city-state practicing democracy managed to defeat an invading empire twice. Later on, some random 19-year-old would go on to conquer all of that empire in one shot, stopping at India. When the English monarchy was restored in 1660, King Charles II ordered the posthumous execution of the members of parliament involved in his dad's execution who had died during the interregnum. Basically, he wasn't going to let the fact that the guys were dead get in the way of vengeance. He literally had them dug up, hung the corpses, and then beheaded them. The dude who first wore a top hat caused a riot by wearing it out on the street. Apparently women fainted and a mob of screaming people formed. He was arrested for breaching the peace, for wearing a top hat. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So there's this Germanic chieftain, Segimerus, and as punishment for fighting Rome, the Romans took his son Arminius and attempted to turn him into one of them. He was raised by a Roman family, given a Roman military education, and ended up as an officer in a force under General Publius Quinctilius Varus. In the meantime, Segimerus dies, so his son is by all rights the chieftain of this tribe. Varus was sent to Germany to fight Arminius' tribe. And, wouldn't you know it, Arminius disappears one night. In the morning, the army moves off through the forest, and, shockingly, gets ambushed by Arminius and an army of angry Germans, who wipe out Varus' army. Varus himself commits suicide to avoid facing punishment for this disaster. And Rome never tried to take territory on that side of the Rhine ever again. Edit, this is now my most upvoted comment. Cool. A man formed his own church, with himself as the head, just because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce for another wife. I can't believe Richard Nixon issued an executive order in 1971 which imposed a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States in order to arrest price inflation. How did anyone believe that would be a good idea or think that it would even be possible to enforce such a policy? Every time I read about the Battle of Stalingrad, I'm just astounded human beings went through that and how Russian victory was actually achieved. The fact that Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe were both presidents when America was at war with pirates. And that no one has made a ducking movie about it yet. That sheet would be CIEIEIC. The United States turned away a ship of Jewish refugees from Germany in 1939 and more than a quarter of them ended up dying in the Holocaust. In the middle of the 20th century, a first world country successfully pulled off a genocide and they did it for years before anyone stopped them. It still boggles my mind. We were using televisions and launching rockets and meanwhile 10 million were being systematically murdered. Harold Holt, the Australian Prime Minister who went in the ocean for a swim and disappeared. The US political group the Tea Party publicly called themselves the Teabaggers for several months before learning it was a slang term for resting your testicles on someone's face while they sleep. I'd like to redirect you to citation needed on YouTube by Tom Scott, which is usually about unbelievable things that happened in history.